the news story from here is framed as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's really kind of the headline. People know Israel through the news story. They really think that Israel's only problem is the Palestinians, and then it looks like Israel is insane because why are we so afraid of the Palestinians? But they don't seem like a power that can really compete with the power that Israel has, and people really reach a string of incorrect conclusions based on the idea that this is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But of course, that's not true. And we just got an illustration of it 2 nights ago here in Jerusalem, where we had this incredible attack from Iran, and hundreds of drones and cruise missiles were fired at Israel. Some were fired from Iraq, some were fired from Yemen, all of them launched by Iranian proxies that have been placed around Israel. And you really had a demonstration of the fact that this conflict is not only with the Palestinians. In fact, Israel's most potent enemy is the Iranians, who are not Palestinians. So often people ask me what I think should be corrected in the news coverage. And I think the main correction that needs to be made is that the country needs to be covered in regional context. We need to understand that this is a war with multiple sides, and that the Palestinians are one part of it, but that they're not the only part of it. And I think correcting that would go a long way to making the story a lot more logical and fair.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Lonely Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Matti Friedman. Matti Friedman is an Israeli-Canadian journalist and the author of multiple best-selling books, including the Aleppo Codex, Pumpkinflowers, Spies of No Country, and most recently, Who by Fire, the incredible story of Leonard Cohen in the Sinai during the Yom Kippur War. In 2014, Matti published 2 essays, one in Tablet magazine and a second one in The Atlantic, where he recounted his experience working for the Associated Press from 2006 to 2011, covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from Jerusalem. Matti's essays shed a very concerning light on the way international media is framing and covering the story, how news organizations launder biased reports through quote-unquote journalistic work that basically portray Israel as a villain, and why this tiny country that constitutes less than 0.5% of the entire Islamic world has become the most covered story in journalism. We recorded this conversation only 2 days after the unprecedented attack launched by Iran and its proxies against Israel, which illustrate once again why framing the story as a quote-unquote Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very, very misleading. Our conversation was focused mostly about Israel, but we also discussed Matti's books. We talked about Matti's experience as a reporter for the AP, why Israel is getting so much bad press, the role of Qatar and Al Jazeera in amplifying the propaganda against Israel, the role of Israeli journalists in covering the story, whether Benjamin Netanyahu is solely to blame for deteriorating relations between the US and Israel, the almost inevitable future war against Hezbollah in the north, the first Lebanon war and the way it impacts how Israel is pursuing wars ever since, Leonard Cohen's visit to Israel in the midst of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, what is the Aleppo Codex, and why did Matti spend several years investigating the story behind the most ancient Hebrew written Bible in the world, and much more. So this conversation was a true pleasure. I have been following Matti for a long time now, and I believe that Matti is one of the most honest journalists out there. And if you read his books, his articles and essays, it's really hard not to conclude that Matti is doing something that so many have forgotten, which is true journalism. Lastly, and on a more personal note, I owe Matti a personal debt of gratitude. In fact, my whole family does, simply because there is a direct connection between my family and one of Matti's books, the Aleppo Codex. My great-grandfather and grandmother lived in Aleppo at the time when the Syrians rioted against the Jews in 1947. My great-grandfather was the first person to rescue the Aleppo Codex from the ruins of the old great synagogue in Aleppo at the time. And Matti captured this moment in his book very well. So, without any further ado, please welcome Matti Friedman. Matti Friedman, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me, Victor.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and I'm excited to have this conversation with you. I can tell you that I have become aware of you first after you published the very, very famous article that you wrote back in 2014 about your experience in the AP. And I wanted to start by asking you about that and basically go back. I believe that from 2006 to 2011, you were working as a reporter for the AP. And I wanted to ask first, what were your expectations coming into this position? I know you obviously were living in Israel for a while before. You served as an IDF soldier for a while, which surprised me that the AP even gave you that job, but still. And I wanted to ask, where were you politically, and what were your views on international media before starting this position in the AP?
I started to work for the AP in 2006. This was around the time of the Second Lebanon War. So I had my military experience in Lebanon, and my parents actually live pretty close to the border with Lebanon. They live in a town called Nahariya. So I knew the area quite well, and I was well positioned to cover that war. And that's how I got the job. I started off as a temporary employee covering the fighting that summer, and then I stayed on. And I didn't expect to have political problems at a mainstream American news agency. My politics are, I would say, center left, whatever that means. It doesn't mean the same thing here as it means in America, of course. But an Israeli of moderate politics, and I certainly had no ideological critique of the Western press at that time. I was very happy to get the job. What I found over about 6 years at the AP was that many of the news decisions were made for reasons that were activist in nature and not journalistic in nature. And that really changed the way I thought about it. And I left the AP at the very end of 2011. It took me a while to put my thoughts in order. And then I published that essay, which you're mentioning, which is an essay that came out in Tablet in the summer of 2014. And actually, it was followed by a second essay, which is really part two of that same essay. This one came out in the Atlantic, maybe I think a month later or 3 weeks later, or something like that. So they're part of the same argument. And in that essay, or in those essays, you see, I guess, the distance that I traveled from the day I started to work for the Western press in the summer of 2006 to the time I left. And this was 2014. It was before Trump, and it was before Americans really thought of the press as being enemies of the people, or in any of these critiques that came from the right side of the political spectrum. So those essays were published in a very different political context. And I can't believe that it's been 10 years, but it's almost exactly 10 years since those essays came out.
It has been 10 years, but when you read those essays, and I did just that a few days ago, again, it is as if nothing has changed. If anything, things became much worse since then. Like your description of the press and the way they portray Israel is it truly looks like you could have written this article just like a few months ago. Regardless of what is happening in the world, regardless of the death toll that is claimed in any other conflict in the world, somehow Israel is just getting so much more attention. And it's not just attention, it's bad attention. So why is it that Israel is getting so much bad press?
It's a complicated question, and there are a few things going on. One is that this is a very easy story to cover, so it's actually a pretty nice place to live. Most of the time, it's safer, as you mentioned, than many American cities. So you can be an American, correspondent from Cleveland or Indianapolis, and you're covering a conflict, but you're in a place that's actually less deadly than the city that you're from. So it's convenient in many ways. You can say whatever you want. It's a democracy. Nothing that you say about the Israeli government will be worse than what Israelis say about the Israeli government every day. So you're operating in an environment that's quite conducive to journalism. Everyone answers their phone. Everyone speaks English. It's much easier to live here than it is anywhere else in the Middle East if you're a woman or gay or Christian or Jewish, and that all plays into it. But the reasons really go deeper. The The Holy Land, of course, looms very large for people in the West. So people just care about a place called Jerusalem more than they're going to care about a place called, uh, you know, Xinjiang or Khartoum. And that's part of what's going on. And the third part of it is that this ends up being a very moralistic story about Jews. So it's a story where you can kind of imagine Jews as embodying the problems in a society at a given time, which is a very old method of processing problems. It's a very old narrative technique. There's a really interesting book written about this called Anti-Judaism, which is written by a professor from the University of Chicago named David Nirenberg, and he traces this kind of storytelling through many centuries of Western history, and not only Western history. It's just a way of understanding what evil looks like, a way of understanding your own society is to project it onto someone else and then condemn them for embodying the kind of evil that you're preoccupied with. And the nature of that evil changes. So Jews have been described as communists and capitalists and tribalists and universalists and people who are anti-Christian and people who are too religious. And it morphs throughout history, but it's a very useful way of explaining the world to stupid people. So now the characteristics that really preoccupy people on the left are colonialism and militarism and racism and things like that. And the story that's told about Israel is very much a story about those qualities. That's on the left. There are other stories about Jews that are told on the right. But the world of the press really overlaps with the world of the academy and the world of the NGOs and the world of the UN. And that's very much a world where the left, and actually a pretty kind of hard ideological version of the left, holds sway, and that's, I think, a lot of what's going on. There's a reason that a lot of the news stories sound a lot like the work that's coming out of colleges in the United States and in Western Europe, and this understanding of the West as being evil and kind of a post-colonial understanding of what's going on, and Jews are cast in the role of the embodiment of colonialism or the embodiment of white privilege, or whatever people don't like, that it's in that light that Jews will be portrayed. And I think that's part of what's going on in the press story. Of course, it's more complicated. It's not true of everyone. There are excellent journalists who do good work, but the press has become more and more ideological, not just about Israel, but about everything. And this all fits into it. I don't think I could have explained any of this or much of this a decade ago when I wrote those pieces about Israel. It was 2014, so the kind of collapse of the mainstream press hadn't happened yet. I thought this was a specific Israel-related problem. I thought this was initially a problem that was just going on in my bureau, and then I realized that this was a problem that was going on in press organizations across the board covering Israel. And what I realize now is that it wasn't just about Israel, and now this kind of ideological activism has really permeated every corner of the press, and it's true of domestic coverage in the United States, it's true of election coverage, it's true of economic coverage, it's true of coverage of immigration in the United States. It's hard to find many journalists who are just trying to explain what's going on. Everyone, or most people, seem to have an ideological axe to grind. So that was my attempt at a short answer to a very complicated question.
I appreciate that. But do you think there is anything like you also go about it in the article itself, and that you try to explain, and you explain kind of the origins of that and how the Jews are kind of an off-the-shelf, easy scapegoat, which we kind of see, as you explain, in many parts of the political discourse all over the world, actually. But is there anything else, like maybe something related to like a political interest that is funded by specific actors, namely, for example, the role of a place like Al Jazeera in this, or Qatar, which somehow is playing like a double role here in this conflict. But it is pretty clear to me, and I think to a lot of other people and some political analysts, that Qatar is definitely not a friend of Israel and should not be portrayed by Israelis and the Israeli government as a friend or as an unbiased negotiator. To what extent a place like Al Jazeera and a place like in a country like Qatar plays a role in this whole like way of framing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the way the media is viewing it?
think that's part of it. I don't think it's being planned in a dark room
Yeah.
somewhere and run kind of in a conspiratorial way. But I do think that there are ideological players here, and they've really come into the vacuum left by the collapse of the traditional press. So 20, 30 years ago, the press meant something. There were people running the show who had very clear journalistic ethics and a clear sense of what they were doing. And then that really collapses around the time that I was at the AP with the advent of social media, Facebook and Twitter. They come online. The economic model that really maintained the press collapses. So now the advertising money is not going to the New York Times, it's not going to the Washington Post, it's going to Facebook. And the whole system really changes. And then it becomes many newspapers simply collapse and disappear. Others survive, and they're now working in this very click-driven economy where a certain kind of story drives clicks. And you see in the newsrooms a lot of the experienced staff disappears because there just isn't money in it, and you see more reporters who are very young, relatively inexperienced, and you see a lot of people who are basically activists, people who are in it not to make money, which sounds crass, but is actually a reasonable reason to go into a profession. You have people who are in it to fight for justice and tell a certain kind of story, and so you see the human landscape of the news really change. But reporters have less time, they have fewer resources, they don't have time to pursue in-depth stories because they have to write 6 stories a day and post them online. The news cycle is now 24 hours, so the news industry is really weakened, and into that vacuum, into this kind of shell of an industry, come all kinds of ideological actors who have money and have an idea that they want to sell. And it's not just countries like Qatar, that's a good example, but it's organizations like Human Rights Watch, which has a vast budget, and Amnesty. It's ideological organizations generally affiliated with the left, just because the press really operates in that ideological ecosystem. And they will give you a report that they've compiled, and you won't have to do any work. You'll just have to write up their report, and that will be a news story. And that's very seductive to you because it's a story you can write in 2 hours instead of spending 2 weeks reporting something. So out it goes as a news story. And what you've done is you've laundered ideological information and you've presented it as journalism. And Al Jazeera, which is a very influential news outlet, not just because a lot of people watch it, certainly in the Middle East, but even in the West, but it increasingly provides staffers to the mainstream news organizations. It's more common to meet people who started off at Al Jazeera or passed through Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera is a Qatari propaganda channel. It's run by the dictatorship in Qatar. And it's a very, I think, if we're looking at this cynically, it's an extremely effective propaganda tool. The Qataris are really smart, and they have endless cash, which is not true of most of the press organizations. And they've used it to help nudge the ideological world of the press in a certain direction. I'm not sure that it wouldn't have happened anyway, but it's certainly an exacerbating factor. And we've seen that the Qataris have been very canny about where they've applied their money in the academy. There's a lot of Qatari money floating around the think tank world, and it just makes sense to have certain opinions or hire a certain kind of person when a lot of your budget is coming from Qatar, and no one will admit it. It'll seem kind of coincidental, but of course it's not coincidental. People basically do what they're paid for, and a lot of the money that now bounces around on the left really comes from ideological actors, and one of those actors is Qatar, and the actors by and large share an animosity to Israel, because they come out of this this ecosystem which really sees Israel as a symbol of what's wrong, which is for them colonialism and militarism. And Israel is a country that's affiliated with the right in their minds, and it's that the question of why Israel is seen in that way, in the left, is it an interesting one, but it is. So a lot of the ideological actors coming into the system and replacing the good old journalistic sensibility, they push things further in this direction. They're more willing to see Israel as an embodiment of evil in the world, or as a really malevolent actor. And that was really not something you'd see expressed openly in the press 20 years ago, but it's very much something that you'll see expressed openly now. There are many factors, but one of them is definitely the one that you mentioned.
Another element that you raised there was the framing of this whole story as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Can you please explain why this framing is so important, and maybe also touch on just the recent events, namely the Iranian missile attack onto Israel, and how this maybe might change the way people are viewing this conflict and this whole issue?
I wish I could be confident that it's going to
Yeah.
change the way people see the conflict, but having been in the journalism business for a long time, I'm not really confident that reality is the main factor shaping the way the story is told. The news story from here is framed as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's really kind of the headline. When I was at the AP every day, the AP, by the way, just for listeners who might not know, is the world's biggest news organization, according to the AP at least. So it's an incredibly influential actor, and they would have us write a story every day that was called Israel Palestinians, and so that's really the framing mechanism through which the story is told. And in that story, there is one side that's much stronger than the other side, and one side that's more Western and militarized, and one side that's much less so. And those things are all true if you accept that the story here is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It also means that the conflict in question is playing out in a country that's about 1/5 of 1% of the entire landmass of the Arab world. So it basically isolates Israelis and Palestinians from the rest of the Middle East and pretends that the conflict here is just between them, that it's a conflict with two actors. And one of them is a good guy and one of them is a bad guy. And that makes it a very effective news story. But if you're Israeli, then you know that most of Israel's wars have not actually been fought against Palestinians. Israel, unfortunately for us, has fought wars against half dozen countries in the Middle East. And most Jews in Israel, as you know, come from elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa. They were pushed out of their homes, not by Palestinians, but by Syrians or by Moroccan Muslims or Tunisians or Persians. And that's very much the story of Israel. So the story of Israel can't be understood as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's one part of the conflict. And it's certainly true that we have a conflict with Palestinians, unfortunately, and we're seeing the worst iteration of it so far right now in Gaza, where we're seeing terrible violence and a real civilian tragedy. And I wouldn't want to be interpreted as saying that that conflict doesn't exist or that I think we're doing great regarding that conflict. I think that Israel has really failed in many ways to handle the Palestinian situation properly. And we see, on occasion, we'll see violence from settlers in the West Bank and things that make me, as an Israeli of moderate politics, extremely uncomfortable would be, I guess, an understatement. It makes me very angry about our failure to keep everyone safe and respect everyone's civil rights in the West Bank. But that's one part of a much broader conflict that's going on. And Israelis get that instinctively just because, you remember that your grandfather fought against the Egyptians in the 1973 war, and your grandmother came from, Aleppo or Yemen. And people just get that. But when people know Israel through the news story, they really think that Israel's only problem is the Palestinians. And then it looks like Israel is insane because why are we so afraid of the Palestinians? They're clearly not able to pose an existential threat to Israel, or at least I guess we can argue about that after October 7th, but they don't seem like a power that can really compete with the power that Israel has. And people really reach a string of incorrect conclusions based on the idea that this is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They think that the conflict would be solved if Israel gave the Palestinians a state, for example, which isn't true. They think that that the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians would solve the Mideast conflict, which is, I think, quite literally what multiple American administrations thought. But of course, that's not true. And we just got an illustration of it 2 nights ago here in Jerusalem, where we had this incredible attack from Iran, and hundreds of drones and cruise missiles were fired at Israel. Some were fired from Iraq, some were fired from Yemen, all of them launched by Iranian proxies that have been placed around Israel. And you really had a demonstration of the fact that this conflict is not only with the Palestinians. In fact, Israel's most potent enemy is the Iranians, who are not Palestinians. So the understanding of the story really needs to be rethought, because a reader trying to understand why the Iranians are firing rockets at Israel from Iran and from Iraq and from Yemen and from Lebanon and from Gaza, that doesn't make sense if you think this is a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. So often people ask me what I think should be corrected in the news coverage, and I would never say that Israel needs to be covered positively to the exclusion of of all else. I think that we deserve a lot of criticism. I just think Israel should be covered like any other country, but I'm not making an argument that all of Israel's decisions have been wise. I think the main correction that needs to be made is that the country needs to be covered in regional context. We need to understand that this is a war with multiple sides, and that the Palestinians are one part of it, but that they're not the only part of it. And I think correcting that would go a long way to making the story a lot more logical and fair.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting what you said about how you want, like, you don't think that Israel should be, covered in a positive way. And basically, I think what you were saying, like, you just want Israel to be covered in an honest way, or as any other conflict or any other country is being covered. Yeah.
Exactly. I don't think we need to be covered. I think sometimes people who love Israel want the coverage here to be about how great our beaches are, how great our tech is, and we invented the flash drive and we invented the cherry tomato, and why don't we talk about that? I mean, that's not going to happen. But I do think that we do deserve to be covered in context, in the context in which we operate, which is the Middle East, and in some kind of rational scope of coverage. So if you have more reporters in Israel than you have in all of sub-Saharan Africa, which was true when I was at the AP. We had more reporters in Israel than we had in the 50-something countries of sub-Saharan Africa combined. So if that's true, then something's wrong. Your coverage, something's gone wrong. You're clearly not offering your readers rational coverage of events on planet Earth. So I think that the coverage of Israel needs to be put in context, and I think it needs to be covered, in a scope that makes sense. It really doesn't makes sense that Israel's getting wall to wall coverage. And not far away from here, there are more than 8 million refugees in Sudan. And no one in the West even knows that that's happening. The death toll in Congo is over 5 million, as far as anyone can tell. It's not, we don't really know because no one covers it. So that just doesn't really suggest that the news is a rational attempt to cover events on planet Earth. And I think it does need to be corrected if people are to have their faith in journalism restored.
Yeah. To try and make the claim for the other side of this argument, meaning you said, and it's pretty clear to anyone following the news, that there are a lot of news organizations, and I think that Barry Weiss, in her famous letter after she resigned from the New York Times, said it as well, that basically those news editorial boards became places where activists have the dominant voices, and truth is kind of go by the wayside and everything. Now, having that in mind and knowing the tactics that Hamas is using and Israel enemies are using, do you think that Israeli journalists or other journalists who know the truth about the Israel and the conflict and how it should be covered, do you think that they should try and push back on that, in a sense that to me, it's kind of the thing that frustrates me, is to see that there's so much activism going on the other side, and there's almost zero coming from the Israeli side. So in a world where the rules have been broken, like the rules of journalism have been broken, is it fair to say that maybe Israelis and maybe Israeli journalists or other journalists should play the other side of this equation?
I think that Israel has or gets a fairer hearing on the right if you look at media outlets that are affiliated with the right. So one of the unfortunate things that's happened is that people can choose whatever narrative they want based on their political leanings. So I think that Israeli journalists, if you want to write in the Wall Street Journal or in places that are affiliated with the right, or Fox News, then you will be able to present Israel's case. The problem is really in what we used to call the mainstream press, which I'm not sure how mainstream it is anymore. But I'm talking about the big media organizations that have largely been captured in different ways by ideological activism. And there you can try, as an Israeli journalist, to make Israel's case, but you're not going to get very far. And I'm saying that from experience. The script is really an ideological script. It's dictated script here is that this is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict in which the problem is that the Israelis are too strong and not willing enough to compromise with the Palestinians. And that remains the narrative, even though it's not really a narrative that explains what's going on. So I don't really blame Israeli journalists for failing to make the case. People can jump up and down and try to tell Israel's story, but it's not really going to penetrate the echo chamber of the press, which is almost entirely divorced from the world of Israeli journalism. You'll see that the people who do most of the coverage here, the correspondents aren't people who speak Hebrew. They're, the Israelis that they hang out with or that they quote are likely to be people from what we would consider far left NGOs, people who are really very distant from the Israeli mainstream. So I don't think that the problem is that Israeli journalists are not being vocal enough. It's that the world of the Western press, to a large extent, is a world of ideological fantasy, and competing facts are really not allowed in. And that's a very broad statement. Of course, there are exceptions. There are exceptions in in publications, and there are exceptions in individuals. But by and large, I think that's true, and that's why so many readers feel, or consumers of news feel homeless. They just don't know where to get information, and you can go to the outlets that are affiliated with the right and hear something about Israel that might be easier for us to digest as Israelis, but you suspect that also might not be accurate. It just might be a different kind of propaganda. And there are attempts now to fill the void. There are masses of news consumers in the center just wandering around looking for something that sounds sane. I'm affiliated with one of them. It's called the Free Press. I know that you're familiar with it, and that's really an attempt to fill the void where the big players used to be. The disappearance of the centrist, the mainstream press is, I think, pretty tragic for everyone. It's tragic for democracy and for just people trying to figure out the world, but it does present an opportunity for scrappy players who are trying to move into that space. And I'm lucky to be affiliated with one of them, but there are others. And if there is to be a better future for journalism, it's going to come from there.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I love the Free Press. I'm a subscriber, and I recommend everyone to subscribe. And I read the articles that you provide. There are a lot other great reporters and journalists in the Free Press, so highly recommend it to everyone. I wanted to ask you something about that, and as someone who you're an Israeli, you live in Israel, you've been there most of your life. Do you think that Israelis understand the way the conflict is being kind of projected or portrayed by the international media? This is one of the points of frustration that I have as someone who's living abroad. I speak to a lot of my Israeli friends, and it seems to me that they don't. Maybe now they understand it a bit better because of the gravity of all the demonstrations that are going on all over the world, and the amount of hate that Israel is getting, and also on college campuses and all of that. But do you think that Israelis understand how deep the problem is in the way that the international media is portraying Israel? And I want to ask you, this is the part one of the question, and part two of the question. A lot of the criticism in Israel, obviously, right now is being laid against Netanyahu, which, again, I'm not a big fan. I don't think you are either. But some of the issues in the relationships between the United States and Israel have been kind of projected on Netanyahu as if he was the sole person to be blamed on that. And again, I'm not a fan of Netanyahu at all, but I don't know if this is an accurate, thing to say. So I guess that's my question, those two-part questions. First, whether Israelis understand it, and second, the kind of casting the blame on Netanyahu when it comes to the U.S.-Israel relationship. Is it a fair thing to do?
I think Israelis increasingly understand that this is a problem. When I published those first essays in 2014, it wasn't yet true. Certainly, people who were in the media world did not see it that way at all. People who tended to be more affiliated with the left. And it was very rare to hear talk on the left of the Israeli spectrum 10 years ago about anti-Semitism or about ingrained bias, and people just weren't onto it. And people are much more onto it now, I think, in part because the gap between the story that Israelis see and the story that's being told abroad is so wide, and also because people are just much more engaged with international narratives because of social media. Like, it's much more common for an Israeli journalist to be active on Twitter in English, which just wasn't true 10 years ago. So things are getting more mixed up, and I think many Israeli journalists, or Israelis in general, have been kind of shocked to see what has happened and how the story is being told. And you have people who are certainly affiliated with the liberal side of the spectrum here, very much engaged in an attempt to correct the narrative, which wouldn't have been true 10 years ago. So I think that people are more aware of it, and most Israelis aren't on Twitter, certainly not in English, and don't really care what people are writing about us in England or France or America, people live their own lives and they consume Israeli media. And I think for most people, it's probably not that immediate, but certainly for people who are in my line of work or people who are in politics, people who have to deal with it or are interested in what the world thinks, I think people are much more aware of the problems that I was talking about 10 years ago, simply because I was in the system. I wasn't smarter than anyone else. I just happened to have a job that made the problems impossible to ignore. I think that about Netanyahu, I think you're right that he ends up being a lightning rod for a lot of criticism, some of which is correct and some of which is unfair. The war that Israel is pursuing in Gaza is very much Israel's war. People understand that what happened on October 7th requires a very dramatic response from us. We understand that we cannot allow Hamas to exist in Gaza, that we're going to have to do something to remove them, and that this is more or less what it's going to look like. And it's awful and it's tragic, and we wish that we didn't have to do it, but there is no other war that removes Hamas. So we're either going to fight them or not. The option of not fighting them became untenable on October 7th. So now we are fighting them. This is what it looks like. It's not that Netanyahu is running this war in a way that's dramatically different from the way that a Labour Party leader would be running the war. And you can see that in the war cabinet, we have centrists like Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot. And the war is not a war run by Netanyahu. So when people hear that many Israelis are critical of Netanyahu or protesting against Netanyahu, I think that foreign observers imagine that people don't like the war or want the war to be prosecuted in a different way or want to stop the war. It's not true for the most part. Of course, there are Israelis who do think that, but most of us don't. So some of the criticism is not about Netanyahu. It's kind of hard, I think, if you're outside Israel, to understand where the line is between criticism for us, for Israelis, or it's hard to understand exactly what we are criticizing when we criticize Netanyahu. I think most Israelis would say that Netanyahu needs to go, and polls show that quite clearly. 71% of Israelis in the last poll said that Netanyahu needs to resign either now or immediately when the war is over. So that means that Netanyahu's public support is very, very low. But that doesn't mean that Israelis think that the war should be abandoned, or that that responding in this way after October 7th was wrong. I think we desperately need new leadership in Israel, and we need it for two reasons. We need it because this society cannot heal and move forward and continue to prosecute the war with a leadership that we don't trust. People don't trust Netanyahu, and they don't trust this government, in part because they failed so miserably on October 7th, and in part because of their personalities. The characters in the government, some of the characters are very extreme and irresponsible and should never have been anywhere near a government ministry. And Netanyahu put them there for his own political survival. And, you can kind of live with that if things are quiet. Many of us couldn't live with that when things are quiet, but you could imagine living with it when things are quiet. But when we're sacrificing hundreds of our kids in a war, and when we're looking at a war that might be even worse in Lebanon and potentially a regional war with the Iranians, the idea of sailing into something like that with a leadership that's divisive and irresponsible is extremely painful for Israelis, and people just don't want it. And I'm one of the Israelis who doesn't want it, and I would be happy to see even a different right-wing leader, a different Likud leader for the present time, just to enable some kind of national unity to allow us to get through this awful period. The second thing that would be improved by a change of leadership is our very important relationship with our Western allies, primarily the United States. And I think that Netanyahu at this point has so much baggage that he's interfering with our ability to prosecute the war. He does not have the trust of the administration. He's antagonized many people who could be on our side otherwise. And I'm thinking of figures in the Democratic Party, but not only figures in the Democratic Party. He's really mishandled our relationship with the United States to an extent that I think is really hampering our prosecution of the war. Before the Iranian attack, I think maybe shifts the calculus a bit, but we've basically been told by all of our allies that we had to wrap up the war, and we're not finished. Hamas is still a military force in Gaza, and we're facing a potential war with Hezbollah. So we're not in a situation where we can stop. And I think a different leadership would be able to buy us more time and credibility in the West, and that credibility for Netanyahu is gone. So I think that we really urgently need a new leadership, if possible, without an election, if necessary, with an election. And we'll see how it plays out in the next couple months.
Yeah, but to kind of push back on that, do you, like, when you see the way this war has been executed in Israel and the U.S. involvement in the war. Again, there's no direct U.S. involvement in the war. There's a lot of cooperation with the U.S. and coordination with the U.S. I think it's unprecedented in Israel's history that, for example, I think Antony Blinken had a seat in the war cabinet. I believe that the Americans were allowed by the Israeli government to operate some sort of a temporary port in front of Gaza. Foreign militaries are dropping, parachuting humanitarian aid. It seems to me like this is, I'll ask you this. Do you think, first of all, that these actions taken by Israel hurt Israeli sovereignty? And what can not Netanyahu, like a different leader of Israel, what can they do differently? Because you can go both ways. I have a little bit of a different opinion than most people in Israel who say United States is a stronger ally, which of course is correct. It seems like a lot of people in Israel are kind of saying, we need to please the Americans. We need to make them happy so they can let us continue with the war. Some would say, no, we are a sovereign country. Israel is a sovereign country. We need to do what we need to do. And if the Americans want to help us, and they will help us, because it's not like we have zero leverage in this conflict, they will do it, and we will pursue this war. And if we didn't have the Americans so much involved, maybe we could have get it over with already. Like, we didn't have to wait for 6 months and have Israeli soldiers standing right on next to the city of Rafah waiting for orders, and the orders just never come.
I think that different Israeli leadership would have been able to prosecute the war differently. So I think that the fact that Netanyahu has so little credibility with the Americans and in the West actually makes the Americans more involved in the war. So if we had a government, we have to remember that for about a year before October 7th, Israel's run by the most extreme government that we've ever had. Our internal security ministry, which is an important ministry, it's the one in charge of the police, is run by a hooligan from the fringes of the right, a guy who Netanyahu said a year earlier was unfit to be a minister. So, we've presented this picture of ourselves in the year leading up to the war of a country that is not in control of itself. There are mass protests. There's, a figure from the extreme right of the settler movement running the treasury. So we're not presenting to the West a government that seems credible, including to many Israelis. So then the war breaks out, and the Americans become, I think, too involved in the war. I agree that Israel has to pursue its own interests. We have to decide what we need to do, and we have to make sure that gets done. And I don't think that's really what happened. The war clearly has been prosecuted too slowly. I think that it had to be prosecuted much, much more quickly. And I think that part of that is that we lack a credible leadership that knows how to really make decisions. I don't think this would have happened if, for example, Ariel Sharon had been the prime minister, or if Yitzhak Rabin had been the prime minister, or if we had a prime minister who really commanded credibility in the world. We had a leadership. We sailed into really one of the worst moments in our history, maybe the worst, with our least credible government. So that's part of the tragedy of this moment. But I agree. I don't think that Israel should let the Americans run the war. I think that the fact that has happened to some extent is really a failure on our part. And in a contradictory way, I think that Netanyahu has this very kind of belligerent attitude towards the Americans that seems to his supporters to be him standing up to the Americans, but actually it's the opposite. If you have that attitude and if you have low credibility with them, then actually they're going to be much more involved than they would be otherwise. So I agree with you, but I think that there too, Netanyahu is not the answer. And I think that he has, to a very large extent, mishandled this in a way that's caused us damage.
Yeah. Okay, I want to ask you, because you wrote another piece for the Free Press about whether the real war haven't even started in Israel, which is a great piece about basically Lebanon and your experience kind of going through the northern Israel right now. And you basically saying the piece that you served as a soldier in the security zone in Lebanon that was established after the Lebanon War and remained, active until May of 2000 when Israel pulled out of Lebanon. And you say basically that because the consequences of confronting Hezbollah were too dire. And so Israel projected this image to its citizens and to everyone that we have Hezbollah contained. And as a consequence, now the security zone is just, instead of being inside of Lebanon, it's kind of right on the border with Israel, inside of Israel, actually. And for those who don't know, approximately 60,000 Israelis who live right on that front with Lebanon are now, for the last 6 months since October 7, are not living in their own homes and are refugees within their own country. Did you come around on this decision to pull out of Lebanon? And what do you think would have been a good way of kind of pursuing this, or how do you think Israel should have dealt with Lebanon in that way since the pullout and maybe even before?
It ends up being such an interesting period, that period in the 90s when Israel has a security zone inside Lebanon, and it becomes very controversial, and soldiers are being killed in Lebanon, and there's a protest movement that says we have to pull everyone out, we have to withdraw to the border, and eventually that happens. And it's seen for many years as a success. Israel had outposts inside Lebanon that were very exposed, and soldiers were being killed on the roads by IEDs, and that really ends in the spring of 2000 with this pullout, which is really part of the whole mindset of the 90s, which says that we're going to withdraw from territory. We're going to turn territory over to our enemies, to our neighbors, in the hopes that that's going to make things better. That was very much the 90s outlook. And it looks very different from 2024, because what we've seen in the Middle East, not only in Israel, since 2000, certainly since 9/11, is that if you create a vacuum in the Middle East, if you pull out of territory and create a vacuum or knock out a political system in a country, what you're going to get is something worse than you had before. And that it's these power vacuums are not going to evolve into something that looks like democracy or even stability. In fact, they're going to collapse. And the vacuum is going to be filled by very extreme actors. And we saw it happen in Iraq. We saw it happen in Syria. We saw it happen in Libya. We saw it happen in Yemen. We saw it happen in the West Bank. And we saw it happen in Gaza. And the logic of it is clear to us now, but it wasn't at the time. So we had the security zone in Lebanon. And fast forward 24 years later, and we have a security zone, as you said, inside Israel. We have 70,000 people who lived along the border until October 7th, who are now not just displaced, it's unclear when or how they can go back. They're not prepared to live along the border fence with Hezbollah fighters a few yards away from them, because October 7th could happen to them. And quite logically, they're not willing to go back. So either the Hezbollah fighters have to be pushed back by an agreement, or they have to be pushed back by military force. But it does lead you to ask or to wonder whether the pullout in 2000 was a good idea. And it's hard to answer that question, because had we stayed in Lebanon after 2000, and Hezbollah was getting much stronger, the Iranians were getting much stronger, we would have undoubtedly lost a whole lot of soldiers if we had been exposed in Lebanon in the way that we were until 2000. On the other hand, we might not be in the situation that we're in now. So it's hard to say. Certainly the strategy, which is really the Netanyahu strategy of the past 10, 15 years, which is just to let these groups sit there and become stronger, that was clearly a mistake. And it's a mistake that we're all party to. It's not like I was lobbying for a massive war with Hezbollah or with Hamas, and Netanyahu was saying no. That was basically where Israel was. But we just want to live our lives, and we're happy to finish every round of violence and go back to investing in this, the stock exchange, or starting a high-tech company, or making a movie for the Berlin Film Festival, or whatever Israelis are doing. And we didn't really want any massive war, but now we understand that if you try to avoid war, in the end, what you're going to get is something much worse than you would have had if you had caught things when they were small. One of Israel's best military analysts is Amos Harel, who writes for Haaretz, and he said a few days ago that not eliminating Hamas in 2014 in that war was a mistake. That in retrospect, that's what we should have done. We should have done it 10 years ago, and we didn't. And what we got was October 7th. So the last big round in Lebanon was in 2006, and since then Hezbollah has become much, much stronger. And our desire for quiet, to buy ourselves some more quiet on the northern border, has led us to this point where we have really a monster across the fence in Lebanon, and we have tens of thousands of our citizens who can't live in their homes. So a new assessment of our security situation needs to be made. And that might involve some rethinking of the security zone and whether it was really a good idea to give it up. I think it's a good point, and it's definitely worth thinking about.
Yeah. You also mention in the same article that the generation of generals that are now leading the IDF spend their formative years as teenager, like new soldiers, if you will, serving in the security zone of Lebanon. And to what extent do you think that has an impact on the way the IDF and kind of the conceptia, in Israel, the concept of how wars should be pursued, basically? Because obviously before we had generals that actually won decisive wars. A war that in Israel you have this frame. We say war that it's a war with no choice, basically. מלחמת אין ברירה, מלחמת יש ברירה. Like no choice to go and pursue this war, and that there is a choice to pursue this war. And Lebanon war was a war that is being, thought as a war of a choice. Basically, Israel had a choice whether to go into Lebanon. Well, some might say differently, but to what extent do you think that has an influence on the way that this war is being pursued today? And actually, every war since the Lebanon war in Israel.
Yeah, I think the Lebanon war really ends the idea that Israel is really going to win a war, because we had this, of course, famous victory in 1967. In 1973, the war starts off as a catastrophe and ends with a military victory. And Lebanon turns into something much less conclusive. And it's being run to a large extent by Ariel Sharon, who's one of the heroes of the Yom Kippur War. And he kind of takes Israel into Lebanon with this very grandiose idea of not just pushing the PLO out of Lebanon, but replacing the government of Lebanon and creating a government that would make a peace agreement with Israel. And the whole thing goes completely wrong and it turns into this quagmire that's very damaging for Lebanon, but also very damaging for Israel. And Israel gets stuck in Lebanon for a few years and is taking lots of casualties, and then withdraws to the security zone and gets stuck in the security zone for 18 years. And it's this very inconclusive war. And the idea of winning a war really kind of evaporates. So if you're a soldier in the security zone, what you're really doing is you're managing these tactical confrontations with very small units of Hezbollah guerrillas, but no one's winning. And I think that kind of carries on into this period of Israeli history where we no longer believe after 2000 that we're going to be able to dramatically change our fate through diplomacy, because the peace process idea didn't work in the 90s. And we're no longer going to be able to change our fate dramatically through a war, because you can't really beat an organization like Hezbollah or Hamas. It's not a country that you can defeat in battle and then they surrender and you have a peace agreement. It just doesn't work like that. So you have these very inconclusive wars, and the idea becomes just buying quiet. So you build a fence, you build a bigger fence, you build a bigger fence, you come up with some high-tech defense mechanisms like Iron Dome, and you're kind of hunkering down in a bunker, which, by the way, was very much what we did in the security zone. We just lived in this bunker. And as time went on, we went out of the bunker less and less, and we just tried to protect ourselves. And we lived inside the outpost and didn't go out very much. And you can see a metaphor there, I think, for something that's happened to Israel, which is that we just want to be left alone, right? We just want to have this country, and we don't really want to pursue some kind of dramatic war. And Israel just lets Hamas run Gaza, basically. When things get out of hand, there's a short military operation, but Israel does not go into Gaza and destroy Hamas, and it does not go into Lebanon and destroy Hezbollah. And we just kind of hope that over time the problem will go away, or at least that they'll just stay on their side of the fence. And clearly that was unrealistic. And we need, I think, military leaders who think differently. So there's a lot of talk about a new political leadership, and I think that's absolutely necessary. As I said, as quickly as possible. But we also need a new kind of military leadership, and that's clear. I mean, here too, like in the Yom Kippur, where there was a concept that led to October 7th, and it was very much a concept that came out of the last 20 years or the last 30 years of small wars, of managing the conflict, of telling yourself that your enemy has been deterred, and then you end up having a much bigger war than you would have had if you fought them on your own terms 10 years ago. So I do think that we need to start thinking about this differently. And one of the changes that needs to happen is definitely in our military, not just in our government, but we need a new way of thinking about about this, and it might mean that we don't have ceasefires anymore. It might mean that we don't say this round is over and now we have a ceasefire. It might mean that the war goes on all the time, not at this intensity, but you never declare a ceasefire because you can't let an organization like Hamas balloon to the dimensions that it reached on October 6th, 2023. So I hope that there'll be a reset there as well.
Yeah. I can share a quick anecdote with you that I've experienced as a young cadet in the Israeli officer training school. I remember I took part in the Second Lebanon War as a young soldier, and I remember during my officer training school, we did a tour in the next to the frontier with Lebanon, and a very, very, very senior officer came to give us a talk, and he was talking about the UN Security Council resolution. I think it's 1701. I'm unsure. And for something like 45 minutes, he just sat there and explained about everything about this resolution and how this resolution is doing this and how we're doing that. And it was literally a year after the war. And I was sitting there in the auditorium trying to understand what this guy is talking about. And at the end of the talk, I raised my hand again in front of like 200 cadets and told him and asked him a question. I said, like, so what is it that we're actually doing? And he kind of humiliated me in front of all my friends, saying, well, sometimes when someone doesn't get it the first time, I will say it the second time. Maybe you can get it now. And, kind of try to, treat me as what the hell is this Pisha knows, and it's sad to me to say, but, it's this attitude that a lot of senior officers in the IDF have that it really bothers me because it was pretty true at the time in 2007 that there's no way any rational Israeli can actually count on a UN force to patrol the Lebanon border. Come on. And when this general is just insisting that this is indeed the case, to me was just, I was very disappointed. Obviously, I felt humiliated, but outside of my personal emotion of humiliation, I was also very disappointed. So it was quite an event for me. I remember it very vividly. So, to kind of allude to what you were just saying, yeah.
Sure. I think that we lived with a lot of lies until October 7th. One of the lies was that there's a UN force in South Lebanon that means something. One of the lies was that our enemies are deterred. They're not going to attack us because they've been deterred. There's a lie in Israel that we have a mandatory draft. We still tell ourselves that that's true, even though a big part of the population doesn't actually serve in the army. So I think what we really need is a period of radical honesty. We really need to tell ourselves the truth about our problems, external and internal, and that's another reason that I think we need a very different kind of leadership because our leaders are dishonest people, and maybe all politicians are, but certainly they become accustomed to these lies, and the lies really blew up in our face on October 7th, and we really need a couple of years, maybe more than a couple of years, of telling ourselves the truth about what is really going on inside our borders and outside our borders. And I think that example that you gave from 2007 is definitely one of the lies. We wanted to end that war, so we accepted an agreement that was basically fictional. And here we are with 70,000 Israelis evacuated from the northern border.
Yeah, this is a great segue to talk about one of your masterpieces, the Who by Fire, that you just you released, I believe, 2 years ago. Wonderful book. I make a habit every Yom Kippur. I listen to V'netane Tokef. It's a wonderful song. It's obviously the Hebrew version of Who by Fire, kind of. But since you released the podcast with Barry Weiss about your book, I make the habit of listening to that podcast because I think it's truly great. So you talk in the book and in the podcast about, again, a kind of a shattering moment in Israel history, which in a way is extremely similar to what happened on October 7th, the thing that you just alluded to. The story of Leonard Cohen in the desert and coming to sing in front of Israeli soldiers is great. It's a story that is somewhat sad, is extremely touching, but is also a story of hope. So I kind of want to ask you, what are you hopeful for when it comes to the events that followed October 7th? Do you think that we are in a moment similar to what happened after Yom Kippur in Israel's history?
I hope we are. And what you see after Yom Kippur in Israel is that the country takes this incredible blow and we lose 2,600 soldiers in the space of 3 weeks. And this is a country that's barely 3 million people at the time. So and those are just the fatalities. Of course, there are many more soldiers injured, and the country doesn't fall apart. It could have fallen apart, but it doesn't. It manages to rebuild and rethink some of its principles, and the military recovers, and there's a period of honesty, I think, after that war, and it's painful. It also involves the Labour Party being booted out of power by Likud a few years after the war. It's directly connected to the war, and here too, I hope we see something similar. I think we need radical honesty. We need to understand exactly what happened and what led to it, not just the tactical failures, but also the failures of policy and politics and leadership. And we need to maybe think of the post 73 years as a model for how we can go about rethinking what we're doing. There's really an earthquake here after 73. It's not just that there are a few changes made to the military and a different leadership. Israeli culture changes, Israeli politics change, Israeli music changes. I spoke about it a bit in that book about Leonard Cohen, but the place really changes, and we're in a similar event. For Israelis, October 7th is really a seminal event. It's not a big terror attack or another round of violence in Gaza. It's really an event that's going to change this country, and I hope that we can find the power to channel it somewhere good. A crisis is awful, but it's also an opportunity, and if it's handled correctly, it can lead us to a better place in a year or 2 years or 3 years. For that to happen, we need different people in charge, and I think that I would even say that the people who I like in the political system need to move aside as well. We need different people. Anyone who is related to the massive traffic jam that kind of snarled our politics over the past 5 years, I think should probably step aside and allow new people in. And I hope that happens. There's a lot of talk now about people getting into politics. People realize that we've abandoned the political system to people who are mediocre and corrupt, and that just can't remain the case if we're going to have to, save our country once this war is over, which is really, really true. It's possible that we can't even wait until the war is over, that we have to start doing it right now. So there are so many positive kinds of energy in this country, and you find the most amazing people in the tech world and in the cultural world. And if you go to an Israeli municipality and you talk to people who are doing the nuts and bolts work of running the country, you meet social workers, there's unbelievable people. The quality of people here is really like nothing I've ever seen anywhere else in the world, but it's largely absent in the political system, and that's really going to have to change. So I really hope that we'll see something like we saw after 1973, which is just a crisis that really changes everything. It changes the way people think. The old leadership is swept out, a new leadership comes in, and Israel post 1973 really manages to put itself together and reach heights that I think that the country couldn't have imagined before the Yom Kippur War. So if we're trying to think positive, I think that we can hope that something like that happens. It's a shame that it takes a catastrophe to do it. It shouldn't have required a catastrophe to do it, but that seems to be human nature, unfortunately.
Yeah. Have you found modern day Leonard Cohen after October 7th? Because the story is so unique and really great about, this rock star finding himself in Israel in the midst of this war, and all of a sudden playing to soldiers in the middle of the desert. Absolutely just a crazy story. Have you found something similar?
I haven't. The closest thing we've had in this war is that Jerry Seinfeld came for a couple of days. There is no Leonard Cohen anymore. The generation of giants has really gone. And I think even if there were a Leonard Cohen, I don't think they would come to Israel. The politics have become much more controversial and much more loaded. Maybe the Leonard Cohen equivalent could be Springsteen or someone like that. But I don't think anyone like that is likely to come. Certainly not to play for soldiers and express support for Israel in a war. It's a different time, and the artists are different. And I think, and wouldn't it be amazing if Leonard Cohen could show up this time and bring us some of his poetry and bring us some comfort and do what he did last time? The closest we're going to get, I think, is listening to his music on Spotify and maybe reading my book.
Yeah.
The man himself is unavailable, unfortunately, in
Unfortunately.
2024.
Yeah. 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 I do want to ask you, and I know we are running out of time here, but I have a personal family connections to one of the books that you wrote, the Aleppo Codex. Fascinating story. I grew up on that story, like just the early beginning of that story, meaning, your great grandfather, my great grandfather was the guy who guarded the big synagogue in Aleppo and took the Aleppo Codex out during the riots during the riots of the Syrians, and after they burned that synagogue down. So I want to ask you kind of, how did you end up writing about this book? Because it's impossible to pin down one subject that can encapsulate all of your books, because they're all very diverse, and I kind of want to ask, what drives you to write a story like that, and specifically on the Aleppo Codex?
So that family connection is amazing. Asher Baghdadi was the sexton of the synagogue, the Great Synagogue of Aleppo in the 40s, and he plays a key role in rescuing the Aleppo Codex, which is the most important copy of the Bible in Hebrew, which is hidden in that synagogue at the time of a riot in 1947. The United Nations votes to create the state of Israel, and there's a riot. There are riots across the Arab world against Jews. One of them is in Aleppo. The synagogue is burned, but the Codex is rescued. And one of the people who rescues the Codex is Asher Baghdadi, who's your great grandfather.
That's right.
And the story, I'm not Syrian, I have no Syrian roots, but I discovered the Codex. Discovered is kind of a funny way to put it, but I found the Codex one day in the Israel Museum. Someone else had already discovered it, obviously, and I had never heard of it. And this was while I was at the AP, and I was basically desperately looking for ways not to cover politics or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I discovered that if you write stories about archaeology and ancient history, then my editors would let me kind of get out of the political coverage. So I was always looking for those stories, and I found the Aleppo Codex. And according to the labels, this is the most important biblical text in Hebrew, and I'd never heard of it. And that struck me as very weird. I think of myself as someone who knows Jewish history, and I grew up in a fairly literate Jewish home, and I'd never heard of the Aleppo Codex. And I started looking into it, and it turned out to have a really crazy story. And I wrote an article about it for the AP. Most of that article I now know was completely wrong, because I just interviewed people who you'd usually interview for a story like this, most of them academics, and they told me a story about the Aleppo Codex that was largely incorrect. And I kept looking into the story, and what I found was that no one wanted to talk about it. I would call to ask about the Aleppo Codex, expecting people to be thrilled to talk about the Aleppo Codex, and they didn't want to talk about it. The academics didn't want to go further than they had when I wrote the article, and people from the Syrian community didn't really want to speak to me. And I realized that there was something going on. There was something dirty about the story. And I spent a couple of years researching it, and the result was that book, which is also called the Aleppo Codex. And it's a book about this manuscript. It's about the way the Bible kind of keeps the Jewish people together over many centuries in the diaspora. It's about an absolutely incredible Jewish community in Aleppo, Syria, one of the greatest Jewish communities on earth. Certainly one of the oldest. The Aleppo Jews had been in Aleppo for centuries by the time the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE. So we're talking about an ancient Jewish community with an incredible history. And the book also ends up being about this very unhappy meeting between the Israeli establishment in the early years of the state and Jews from the Arab world. So the country is founded by Jews who came from Eastern Europe for the most part, socialists. And then there's a massive wave of immigration after the state is founded that comes largely from the Islamic world. And the meeting between those two parts of Jewish society here, the meeting is incredibly painful, and the pain persists to this day. And the story of the Aleppo Codex ends up being a way of talking about that too, because the book kind of gets caught up in the drama of the collapse of the Jewish world in Islamic countries in the 1950s, and the move of the remnants of that world to Israel, along with the remnants of the Aleppo Codex. So for me, it was an incredible education, more than explaining that story to other people. I wrote the book to explain it to myself. And I met the most incredible people, including your relatives.
Yeah, my grandma. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. When I was in France, I told you before, I spent a lot of time in France. I went to school there. One of my friends is his grandma. She's translating books from Yiddish to French. She's one of the only people who does that, and she's very successful in doing that too. And she gave an interview, and in the interview that she gave, she's a Holocaust survivor. She called the Holocaust, and she said, I don't want to call it the Holocaust. I don't want to call it Shoah. I call it Churban. In Yiddish, she says Churban. I never heard that.
Destruction.
Yeah, the destruction, which I think is, it's not a word that we use often to describe that. But when I read the Aleppo Codex, I have to say that, it made me super angry to see the way the Israeli government at the time kind of treated my ancestors, like the people who came from the Islamic world. I know I don't look like someone whose ancestors came from the Islamic world, but it's 100% correct, unless my parents are hiding something from me. And it's and I think the story, as you mentioned, talks about this collision between those two, the new formed Israeli country and these old ancient like communities in Aleppo. And it talks about this destruction, this churban of this amazing community that predated Islam, that existed for thousands of years, and now it's gone. But I wanted to really thank you for that, because it's a wonderful book, and obviously there's a personal element to that as well, and it's really great. So I really wanted to thank you for that. And I know that we are running out of time here, so once again I want to really thank you for taking the time to speak to me. If people don't know, you are writing for the Free Press. You published several books in recent years that all of them are a must read, I think. And anything else, anything that somewhere people can find you or follow your work and all that?
Yeah, I have the usual social media platforms. I'm on Facebook and I'm on Twitter. I'm not too active, but I do usually remember to post my articles there. These days I'm writing mainly for the Free Press, occasionally for the Atlantic and for a few other places. I'm not too hard to find.
Yeah, and again, I would want to say that the Free Press is one of the sources for hope, I think, when it comes to international journalism, and much more than that, actually. So, Matti, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, appreciate your writing and your work. It has been a pleasure speaking to you in person.
Thank you so much for having me.